So, there have been a multitude of reports and articles and videos talking about Taiwan, especially since the war in Ukraine erupted, because people love to speculate about war and conflict, and it makes for good ratings, even if you regurgitate the same bullshit over and over again. And to be clear, some reports and videos are great, but honestly, most of them are pretty terrible. The problem is that something can appear convincing at first glance if someone has good production value and spiffy graphics. Think of a talking head explainer YouTube channel where you think they're very smart and explain everything perfectly, until they talk about something that you happen to know a lot about, and then you notice how many things they get wrong, and now you start to doubt all their other videos too. And oftentimes, the comment sections are even worse, and that's not really your average commenter's fault, when the media is constantly confusing people and getting things wrong, repeating statements such as Taiwan and China split in 1949, which is absolutely inaccurate. As someone who actually studied this topic for years and now currently lives in Taiwan, I figured I'd try to provide a basic explanation of the things the media constantly gets wrong about Taiwan. I'm not going to tell you whether Taiwan should be independent or not, but I will explain why the question in of itself may be misleading or flawed. I'm not going to talk about which political party is better for Taiwan. What I'm going to try to do is lay out all the necessary background information so you can view news articles and videos in the future in a more informed manner and decide for yourself. Today, I'll try to address the following 4 misconceptions as neutrally and simply as possible. Number 1, Taiwan actually believes it is part of China. Number 2, support for independence is low in Taiwan. Number 3, Taiwan isn't serious about defending itself because military service is only 4 months. And last of all, America only defends Taiwan because of semiconductors. The goal is for you to come away from this video with a better understanding of the complexities of the China-Taiwan situation, while noting that at its core, it's actually a pretty simple question. Alright, let's get started. Before we go any further, we need to define terms and abbreviations because I'm going to go crazy if I had to say the full name of everything over and over again throughout the video. And you're going to go crazy if I just throw a bunch of abbreviations at you without explanation. I also need to define some terms to reduce miscommunication. So the first one is pretty easy. PRC. This stands for People's Republic of China. This is the big country with this flag that is generally known to the world as China, or popularly online, West Taiwan. As a Taiwanese, I personally think the name West Taiwan is really dumb, and maybe after finishing this video you'll understand why. Next, we have ROC, which is short for Republic of China. Although the name Taiwan is oftentimes used interchangeably with the name Republic of China, since it's confusing as hell to refer to two countries using very similar names, in this video, understanding the difference between the ROC and Taiwan, as well as where the two overlap, is very important. So I'll try to be as precise as possible, using either ROC and Taiwan to mean different things. In your everyday life, just go ahead and use Taiwan to refer to the modern-day nation-state. No one really cares, with a few exceptions, which I will probably explain more in this video. CCP, Chinese Communist Party. If my understanding is correct, the official abbreviation is now Communist Party of China, or CPC, but I've gotten so used to saying CCP that I'm just going to keep getting it wrong if I try during this video. So for the sake of my editing sanity, I'm going to use CCP, but just note that both CCP and CPC are used. It's not meant to be an insult to use their old name. As said in the beginning, my goal is to try and provide an introduction to a complex issue in as unbiased a way as possible under the circumstances. Next is KMT, which means Chinese Nationalist Party. KMT is the romanization of Kuomintang, which in Chinese literally translates into Chinese Nationalist Party. This is one of 2 major political parties in Taiwan, and probably the primary source of everyone's confusion. If you want to blame someone for why your textbooks about the topic of Taiwan are so confusing, you can blame them. I'll explain why later. The KMT has been historically opposed to annexation by the CCP. If someone says, Taiwan believes they are the true rightful rulers of China, then the KMT is basically the reason why. Anyway, the KMT kind of doesn't believe this anymore, as things have changed over the years into something a bit more confusing. We'll get into that. For now, just know that the KMT established the Republic of China in, China, and after fighting and losing the Chinese Civil War to the CCP, retreated to Taiwan, which, by the way, had only been given to the ROC in 1945 after Japan's defeat in World War II, where it has survived to this day, though it's been faring pretty poorly in elections since 2019 or so. Here's where it gets tricky. And here is where I might lose the Chinese nationalists watching this video, because although I'm ostensibly trying to explain the issue in a neutral way, I will be using the seemingly loaded term annexation rather than unification or reunification. The reason I say this is because currently, the PRC wants Taiwan to become part of its territory. Taiwan isn't currently part of its territory and never has been. Whether or not some form of political union is good for Taiwan or China is not something I'm planning to discuss in this video. I'm simply saying that since the two have never been united, there's no such thing as reunification. And considering the majority of people in Taiwan have no interest in becoming part of the PRC, then ostensibly it would have to happen unwillingly, and thus the term annexation is most accurate. Now, of course, smart minds may disagree, and that's fine. I'm just explaining why I use the term. Next is Chinese. Now, normally when people say the word Chinese in a modern day sense, they're referring to the PRC and its citizens, and that's fine. Yes, my country's name is officially the Republic of China, but seriously, no one actually believes Taiwan represents the 1.6 billion people across the strait. If I use the word in this video, it will be in a more general sense, as a not particularly clearly defined thing, sort of like Judeo-Christian tradition, or Greco-Roman civilization, which mean whatever the speaker wants them to mean in a positive or negative sense. Both the KMT and CCP might consider themselves Chinese, though that doesn't necessarily mean they see themselves as belonging to the same thing politically. Taiwanese. This term may be confusing because its modern-day usage is quite different from how it might have been used throughout much of the 20th century. But anyway, I use this term to refer to the people who were living on the island of Taiwan before 1945, regardless of who it was controlled by, whether the Qing dynasty, the Japanese Empire, the Chinese nationalist KMT, or the democracy we see today. The indigenous peoples are the ones who got to the island first, as far as we know. In a sense, they are the true Taiwanese, but in my conversations with them, they actually don't prefer to be referred to as Taiwanese, but rather by their tribe, such as Ami, Atayal, Bunun, Paiwan, Sedik, Tao, and so on. When I use the term Taiwanese, I'm mostly referring to the people that came from China and not the indigenous peoples. This isn't meant to diminish them, but rather as a shorthand, because constantly saying the earliest settlers is even more confusing. Okay, so terms and definitions might have gone on a bit longer than I had originally intended, but I promise you that this will make things a lot less confusing moving forward. One last short summary that may make things a bit easier to understand is this. So the island of Taiwan has been inhabited for at least hundreds of years, administered by a variety of different governments, such as the Dutch and the Qing dynasty. Taiwan was ceded to Japan in 1895 after Japan defeated the Qing Empire in the Sino-Japanese War, and that's generally seen as the first time the island came under unified control, though the indigenous peoples put up quite a fight. When Japan was defeated in World War II, it gave up its colonies, including Korea and Taiwan, and at the time, since the ROC was considered the legitimate government of China, then Taiwan was given to the ROC. However, the ROC didn't really get to enjoy its victory since the Chinese Civil War, which had been put on pause during the Japanese invasion of China, resumed shortly, and the ROC was overthrown by the CCP, who established the PRC in 1949. The ROC was not completely eliminated though, as it floated its final command center to the island of Taiwan, and has managed to survive until today. So, in short, the ROC was established before the PRC and has never officially surrendered. If you absolutely require an American analogy to make things easier to understand, then just imagine that in the American Civil War, the Union, which was founded first and seen as the more legitimate government at the time, is defeated by the Confederacy and flees to Hawaii, which the Confederates never controlled. And now the Confederacy controls the contiguous United States, while the Union controls Hawaii. Though the original residents of Hawaii are like, what the fuck, this is your fight, not ours. The countries of the world mostly recognize the Confederacy as America because it is rich and powerful. But that doesn't mean the Union on Hawaii is therefore automatically a part of Confederate America. To add salt to the wound, let's just imagine that Confederate America insists that the world referred to the Union on Hawaii as American Honolulu. Okay, I think I've taken this analogy far enough. Now that we've gotten this basic background out of the way, we can begin addressing the first main conception that I most commonly see online. Number 1. Taiwan actually believes that it is part of China. So, the first point to understand is, does a one-party dictatorship truly represent a country? If I said, America doesn't believe in man-made climate change, would this be a true statement? Clearly, a significant percentage of the population believes that climate change is a globalist hoax. So how high should this proportion be before I can say that quote-unquote America believes this? You might argue that unless it's at least a majority of the population, it would be misleading to say that America as a whole believes this or America believes that. That seems reasonable enough. To determine what a country thinks, let's get an idea of the majority opinion via opinion polls or something. However, this approach also has its problems. In the case of authoritarian countries, it's quite difficult to determine what people actually believe, since being politically incorrect actually has consequences beyond getting cancelled on Twitter. Let's first set up some very important context, which is that Taiwan was put under one of the longest periods of martial law in the world, lasting between 1949 until 1987. So imagine the government of the Republic of China on Taiwan in 1975 says that they are true China, and they may truly believe this. But does this represent the millions of everyday people in Taiwan whose voices were silenced? Do their beliefs actually matter, or are the beliefs of the government elites the only ones that matter? And again, these elites run the country as a dictatorship. It is possible that maybe 99% of Taiwanese people also believe this, but you wouldn't know because they weren't allowed to answer the question, or at least answer honestly. It is true that the KMT put a lot of effort into teaching Taiwan that yes, they should believe that they are all Chinese and true China. So the percentage of people that bought it was certainly higher than 0%. But at any rate, what I'm trying to say is that it's inaccurate to say that Taiwan believes that it is true China. We can say that the KMT, a political party, at some period of time, believed it was the rightful ruler of the territory currently controlled by the PRC. Maybe even to this day, the KMT believes that it is the true descendant of the best aspects of Chinese culture preserved in Taiwan. But in any case, it is misleading to say that Taiwan as a country believes this because we are true China is the sentiment of a political party, rather than the results of some nationwide opinion poll. The political party claimed to represent the entire country, but as we'll soon find out, that may not be the case. The second thing to understand is, well, wait a minute, don't all Taiwanese come from China anyway? Some commenters claim that Taiwanese want to retake the mainland. As explained earlier, it is true that the KMT, which originally came to Taiwan from China, did control the territory of China before losing the Civil War to the CCP and retreating to Taiwan. However, something that most news articles fail to mention is that when the KMT retreated to Taiwan, it was actually a minority government that ruled over a majority population, similar to the apartheid in South Africa, where the minority whites ruled over the majority blacks. These refugees of the ROC escaping China only made up about 10 to 15% of Taiwan's full population. The rest of the Taiwanese were already in Taiwan and had been there for generations. Certainly, the establishment of the ROC in 1912 technically didn't even have anything to do with them, as Taiwan was a Japanese colony at the time. So in a sense, it is sort of weird when people say, "Happy birthday, Taiwan," when we celebrate the establishment of the ROC on October 10th, since that happened somewhere else. To be clear, after World War II, the KMT and ROC imported a Chineseness to Taiwan that was not there before, with little to no regard for existing cultures, seeing Taiwan as simply a temporary step to reclaiming territories now controlled by the PRC, and they took many measures to convince the locals of the righteousness of this cause through new Sinocentric education. I am not going to talk about if this was a good or bad thing. Well, wait a minute, you say. Even if the people that came with the KMT after the Civil War were just a small percentage, surely the Taiwanese that came earlier also came from China, and therefore also see themselves as Chinese. And first of all, there's a difference between political identification and ethnic background. It's accurate enough to say that most Taiwanese are descended from Chinese migrants that came either in the earlier wave or the more recent wave. Yet there are some very big differences between how the two groups of people see themselves. Many of the people that came after 1945 see themselves as Chinese because, well, they literally were Chinese that got kicked out of their homes by the communists. However, Taiwan had been ruled by Japan for 50 years before this, so at the very least, the two groups of people did not have shared experience in this regard. I mean, hell, they didn't even speak the same language. So, wait, what? Taiwan, don't they speak Chinese? Okay, so it's true that Mandarin Chinese is now the dominant language in Taiwan. However, Mandarin is in fact one of many dialects from China that eventually became dominant. When Chinese settlers came to Taiwan during the Qing dynasty, many of them spoke other dialects, among which the most common was Hokkien or Minnan, which is what we typically refer to as Taiwanese nowadays, and which is also spoken among the Chinese diaspora in several other countries like Malaysia and Singapore. So, at this point in time, Mandarin was by no means dominant. Then, when Japan took over in 1895, Japanese was established as the official language, so many Taiwanese learned Japanese, many of which even took Japanese names. In fact, the founder of instant ramen, Momofuku Ando, was actually Taiwanese, who ended up becoming a naturalized Japanese citizen later on. And to be clear, I'm not talking about if teaching a more common language in school instead of the native language was a good or bad thing. Is something that might be ultimately beneficial always justified? The point is, though, when the KMT took over in 1945, most of Taiwan did not, in fact, speak Mandarin. They generally spoke either Taiwanese or Japanese or other Chinese dialects such as Hakka and the indigenous languages. And of course, for the KMT, Taiwanese speaking Japanese was not acceptable, considering how brutal Japan had been to China during the war. And so Japanese was outlawed, as was Taiwanese, as the KMT forced everyone to learn Mandarin instead, which was effectively a foreign language to the locals, and this, of course, gave the newcomers an advantage because they had a head start. To the right, I've shared a screenshot from a movie where we can observe the offender being forced to wear a sign saying, "I love speaking the national language," or Mandarin, if they had been caught speaking Taiwanese. The second misconception that I often hear is that support for independence is low in Taiwan. So this is something that might be technically true, but is very misleading if you don't understand what the term Taiwan independence actually means. So, Taiwan independence from whom? It actually refers to independence from the ROC and not the PRC. As I've established earlier, Taiwan became part of the ROC in 1945. At first, most Taiwanese were fairly optimistic about this. Although Taiwan was actually treated reasonably well under Japanese rule, Taiwanese were still undoubtedly second-class citizens, and they looked forward to actually receiving the rights promised to them by the ROC as laid out in the Constitution and the three principles of the people. Unfortunately, the honeymoon didn't last long. Since Taiwan was part of the Japanese Empire during the war, it had actually been bombed by American air raids, and many Taiwanese died as soldiers for the Japanese Empire. But overall, Taiwan didn't really suffer too much from the war, all things considered, compared to China, which lost 20 million people as a result of the Japanese invasion. Many of the Chinese taking over Taiwan for the ROC viewed the Taiwanese as collaborators at best and traitors at worst to the Chinese state, and viewed them as unworthy of ruling their own land. At this time, the KMT was embroiled in the fierce Chinese Civil War, and resources and manpower from Taiwan were stripped from the island to go towards the war effort in China. Many Taiwanese were bitterly disappointed to see that their new leaders were seemingly dismissive, ignorant, yet arrogant, wrecking the infrastructure that had been built up during the Japanese administration, and seemingly viewing Taiwan as only another land to be exploited for resources. Anti-government sentiment began to fester as more and more Taiwanese began to see the KMT not as liberators, but as just another occupying power that was even worse than the Japanese had been. Even though Taiwanese were also second-class citizens under Japan, at least Japan made the trains run on time. Point being, if you see opinion polling about Taiwan, and you see something like, quote-unquote, only 19% support independence, you need to make sure what they're talking about. Independence from whom? Independence from the ROC and independence from the PRC are two completely different things. In almost all cases, this low number is referring to independence from the ROC, for which the mainstream opinion is that it's not very necessary anymore. As for declaring independence from the PRC, that doesn't even make sense because Taiwan was never ruled by the PRC, which was established in 1949. It's sort of like asking if the UK should declare independence from the United States. How would you even answer that question? A more logical question might be if the UK should join the United States, but the UK declaring independence is simply illogical. Number 3. Taiwan isn't serious about defending itself because military service is only 4 months. This misconception is often thrown around, probably by Americans who are understandably wary of spending yet more blood and treasure on people half a world away that don't appear to be serious about fighting for themselves. The instant takeover of Afghanistan, once America officially pulled out, is seen as Exhibit A nowadays. Pundits will point out to the fact that in Taiwan, mandatory military conscription for men is now 4 months compared to 2 years or even 3 years back in the day. They say that Taiwan's short conscription period means Taiwan's soldiers are all insufficiently trained and therefore unable to defend against an invasion, and therefore America should let them rot. Now, this reflects a fundamental misunderstanding of Taiwan's current military strategy, which is namely that Taiwan has essentially been a volunteer military for years, and the conscription system is in fact now a reserve training system, and not a way to train the main force. Taiwan has maintained a policy of conscription since 1951. In 1954, the majority of conscripts served 2 years, though conscripts serving in the Navy, Air Force, and Special Forces generally had to serve for 3 years. The structure was much closer to that of Singapore, Israel, and Korea, which all have comparable conscription periods, with conscripts comprising the bulk of the military's manpower, including some non-com or officer positions. This made sense at the time, as you needed a huge military if the goal wasn't simply to defend yourself, but in fact to invade and take over China. Now, obviously, this goal was never realized and became less and less realistic as the years went by. For various reasons, including recognition that retaking China was never going to be possible, the length of conscription was reduced and shortened several times until a total of 1 year remained by 2008. And finally, as Taiwan transitioned to a volunteer force, conscription was cut to 4 months in 2013, which is the system we see today. Now, this isn't to say that Taiwan's military does not have recruitment problems. It does indeed have trouble hitting recruitment goals, and the workload for soldiers is quite high because of limited manpower, deprived of conscripts that used to be used for more mundane, time-consuming tasks like cleaning and standing watch. But again, the point is that it's very misleading to claim that Taiwan's troops are untrained because they only serve for 4 months, because the vast majority of the military is in fact volunteer and serves for a minimum of 4 years, and even longer if you're an officer. Conscripts are effectively a separate force, one that is not intended to be the crux of the defense. Conscripts have never been the ones flying fighter jets or manning missile sites, driving tanks or commanding submarines, and they aren't now. To truly evaluate the strength of the Taiwanese military, you don't just look at its reserve training system, 4 months, but its actual main force. Now, it may very well be that training is shitty for the volunteer force as well, but that's not something directly evaluated by the length of the reserve training. Last of all, there's this idea that America only defends Taiwan because of semiconductors. So, okay, this is a weird yet easy one, so I saved it for last because I can tell you're getting tired of me blabbering on. So, TSMC, or Taiwan Semiconductor Company, which is most famous in the news nowadays, it did not exist in the 1950s when President Truman ordered the 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait to deter PRC invasion during the Korean War. Taiwan has strategic value to the United States not simply because of semiconductors, though that has certainly become a consideration, but rather because of its location. It's not even about democracy, since the US supported Taiwan even as we were a one-party dictatorship. We can talk about it more in a future video, but suffice it to say, the US defended Taiwan from Chinese invasion long before semiconductors were a thing, so it really isn't the main reason. So, that about wraps it up, and that largely covers the main misconceptions I've observed. Any factual corrections are welcome, as I'm only human, and I'm biased towards preferring that Taiwan remains independent, and it's possible I got a few details wrong. But please do keep in mind that my goal was to explain how things are, and not necessarily how they should be. If you come to me saying, Taiwan is a part of the PRC, then that's simply factually incorrect. If you say that Taiwan should be a part of the PRC, and it's only because of the meddling Americans and the evil DPP brainwashing Taiwanese people to hate Chinese people that we're still separated, then I might disagree, but you're just stating your opinion rather than asserting something as fact, so I'll just smile and wave. But ultimately, even if I've made tons of mistakes or I'm totally full of shit, I think you could also find value in this video by seeing it as what Taiwanese are delusional about, which is also pretty useful. At any rate, thanks for sticking around with me for this long. I really appreciate it. As is the case for any other country, there are so many other interesting topics that could be addressed, such as even the US believes Taiwan is part of China. Not really. Or what's the deal with the term Chinese Taipei? The emergence of the ROC Taiwan term, a history of baseball in Taiwan, the White Terror era of martial law in Taiwan, the US Taiwan Defense Command, and if the interest is there, I will probably make a follow-up video, so please comment to let me know. Otherwise, well, I might make one anyway when I'm bored. But thanks again, and see you next time.